This video is about how elements cycle throughout the living and non-living portions of the ecosystem. First up is water. Water never stays in one place all the time. It's constantly moving from the air to the soil, into plants, back into the air, back into the soil, back into plants, and around and around and around. For instance, when water is warmed up, and let's pretend it's an ocean or a lake or a pond, water evaporates from this body of water into the clouds. Eventually, it will cool down and it will rain. That's precipitation. So water is moving from an ocean or a lake or a pond or a river up into the air and back down. That's a small little cycle. But also what occurs is water in the soil goes into plants and transpires from the plants into the air. I'll explain what that means on the next slide. Once you have a lot of water in the air, it condenses and cools, and then it comes down as precipitation. Again, that's like rain, snow, hail, sleet. Eventually, all that water collects in the ground, and it runs off into oceans and lakes and rivers, and it starts all over again. Again, water never stays in one place all the time. It usually goes into the air, back into the soil, into a plant, into the air again, back into a soil, into a plant, and around and around and around. One of the biggest components of the water cycle is the evaporation of water off the leaves of plants. This is called transpiration. 90% of the water taken up by the plant's roots are eventually transpired out the top of the plant. This accounts for most of the water vapor that's out in the air. Transpiration again is when water evaporates off the leaves of plants. I'm going to go back to the last slide to show you. Notice in the middle, a lot of the water that's evaporating into the air is actually from plants, not just from bodies of water. It comes from the soil where the water is, into the roots of the plants, into the plant, transpires out of the plant, back into the air, and around and around and around again. Nitrogen also cycles throughout the environment. Nitrogen is mostly found in the air. The majority of air, it's like 78% I think, of the air that you're breathing is actually nitrogen gas. But it turns out you can't do anything with that nitrogen gas. You just breathe it back out. We can't use nitrogen gas. But we need nitrogen, so we have to get nitrogen from somewhere else. Nitrogen gas goes into the soil, and there are bacteria living on the roots of legumes which convert it into a form that plants can use. Legumes are just a type of plant. I think they're like clover or pea plants. And the bacteria that live on their roots take that nitrogen gas that's normally unusable and convert it into a form that the plants can actually use. It's actually called fixing the nitrogen. They fix the nitrogen into a form that plants can use. So these plants or legumes eventually absorb the nitrogen that the bacteria made for them, and now it's inside their bodies. Animals are then going to eat the plants, and so now the animals have a bunch of nitrogen inside them. Unfortunately, animals and plants always die, and so decomposers like fungus and bacteria will break down the dead bodies of the animals and plants and return the nitrogen back into the air. That's how nitrogen cycles throughout the environment. Starts in the air, goes in bacteria, goes into the soil, goes into the plants, goes into the animals, goes back into the soil with those decomposers, and eventually makes their way back out into the air. Why do animals and plants actually need nitrogen? Well, it's important for their growth, specifically to make proteins. Remember, proteins have the element nitrogen. It's C, H, N, and O they use all the time. Nitrogen is really, really important in making proteins. Unfortunately, because plants and animals can't get the nitrogen from the air, they need it fixed. And they get it fixed by bacteria. Bacteria live on the roots of legumes. They specifically live in these little things called nodules, these little like bumps. Do you see these bumps on the roots of the legumes? There's tons and tons of bacteria inside there. The bacteria fix the nitrogen gas that's normally unusable and convert it into something that the plants can use. So they put a bunch of nitrogen in the soil. Now the roots of the plants can absorb that nitrogen from the soil. Now it's in the plant. The animal eats the plants. Now everyone has nitrogen. The process of bacteria taking that nitrogen gas and converting it is called nitrogen fixation. It's fixing the nitrogen for us so that we can use it. The final cycle is the carbon and oxygen cycle, which is entirely dependent on photosynthesis and cellular respiration. There is a ton of cellular respiration going on. Remember, every single organism does cellular respiration. All plants, all animals, in their mitochondria, they breathe out CO2. CO2 goes into the air. We have tons of CO2 in the air. We also have more CO2 than we actually need because we're burning fossil fuels. That's called combustion. Remember that whole global warming, climate change thing? We are putting a lot more CO2 in the air than we need, but that's beside the point. Lots and lots of CO2 in the air. What takes CO2 out of the air? Plants. Plants go through photosynthesis in their chloroplasts. They take CO2 and make sugar and oxygen. Well, who uses the sugar and oxygen? The animals do. The animals are going to take that sugar and oxygen through cellular respiration. They're going to breathe out CO2. And it's going to go around and around and around this cycle. So notice, cellular respiration produces CO2, photosynthesis uses CO2. You may remember this picture. Cellular respiration happens in a mitochondria, uses glucose and oxygen, produces carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So that's how CO2 is produced, through cellular respiration. Well, how is CO2 removed from the air? Well, CO2 goes into a plant, specifically the chloroplast of the plant, and through photosynthesis, CO2 and water combine with light energy, and glucose, which is a sugar, and oxygen is produced. So if you want to follow carbon in this cycle, carbon is produced by cellular respiration, used by photosynthesis. If you want to follow oxygen, oxygen is used in cellular respiration, produced in photosynthesis. What about this picture? You guys learned about this already. Cellular respiration is when you take oxygen and sugar and you convert it into carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Plants, through photosynthesis, take that CO2 in that water and convert it into oxygen and glucose. It goes around and around and around. This is the carbon and oxygen cycle. Animals and plants are really important to cycling the carbon and the oxygen around the environment. This is all I have. Write down your questions and ask me in class.